Hollywood's biggest failures often become cinema's hidden treasures. The 1960s saw visionary directors crash and burn at the box office while creating masterpieces. One director nearly bankrupted an entire studio. Another had Soviet tanks literally roll through his production. Which legendary film got condemned by the Vatican? Stick around. Number 15. The Swimmer, 1968. This might be the weirdest movie Burt Lancaster ever made. A suburban guy in swimming trunks decides to travel home by swimming through every backyard pool in his wealthy neighborhood. Each new pool reveals another piece of his shattered life, and by the end, you realize you've been watching a man's complete psychological breakdown. The whole thing plays like a fever dream in chlorine. Behind the scenes, total chaos. Director Frank Perry got fired midway through filming. Sidney Pollack quietly took over, shooting several crucial scenes and a completely new ending. Lancaster battled both directors constantly, especially during reshoots months later when he'd visibly aged and needed a wig that made everything look even stranger. Budget was around $1 million, but it completely tanked, barely making $200,000 before being yanked from theaters. Critics were baffled, audiences stayed away, and the film disappeared for decades. Time has been kind, though. Roger Ebert later called it a strange, disturbing masterpiece, and film scholars now praise its surreal examination of American suburban emptiness. John Cheever, who wrote the original short story, called it the most faithful adaptation of my work ever, which is high praise. Indeed. For a psychological nightmare hidden in broad daylight sunshine, The Swimmer delivers something you won't soon forget. Number 14. King Rat, 1965. This isn't your standard noble World War II film. King Rat drops you into the filthy, desperate world of a Japanese prisoner camp in Singapore where survival means forgetting everything decent about yourself. George Segal plays Corporal King, an American prisoner who thrives through hustling, scamming, and absolute moral flexibility, including breeding rats for meat when everyone else is starving. What makes this film special is its brutal honesty. There are no heroes here, just survivors. The actual production hit too close to home for comfort. Actor Denholm Elliott had been a real POW in World War II and reportedly broke down several times on set. Director Brian Forbes shot for 62 grueling days and later admitted he could barely talk about the experience without choking up. Studio executives had no idea how to market a war film with zero glory, so they just sold it as standard military fare. Audiences in 1965 were still clinging to the idea of the noble soldier, and King Rat made them profoundly uncomfortable. The box office was dismal, and in some countries it was outright banned for its unflattering portrayal of British officers. Today, King Rat stands as one of the most honest war films ever made, with James Clavell's semi-autobiographical story hitting harder than any manufactured Hollywood heroism. Martin Scorsese later included it in his list of movies that need to be rediscovered, calling it the war film that refuses to lie about what survival really costs. Number 13. The Night of the Generals, 1967. Here's a war movie wrapped inside a murder mystery stuffed with enough stars to light up the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Peter O'Toole plays a Nazi general with ice blue eyes who might be a serial killer, slaughtering prostitutes in occupied Warsaw. Omar Sharif is the detective trying to solve the case while navigating the chaos of World War II. It's ambitious, strange, and completely original. The production was almost as twisted as the plot. Constant rewrites, filming across 3 different countries just to meet co-production obligations, and a budget that spiraled completely out of control. Producer Sam Spiegel wanted another Lawrence of Arabia, but ended up with something far darker and more confusing. Critics were baffled by its mix of psychological thriller and war drama. The New York Times called it an unwieldy, overlong muddle, and audiences stayed away in droves. The film barely made half its money back and quickly disappeared into late-night TV rotation. What's fascinating now is how ahead of its time it was. The Night of the Generals tackles moral corruption, the psychology of evil, and the way war creates perfect cover for monsters to operate. O'Toole's performance as the mentally unraveling General Tanz remains one of his most disturbing and underrated. For a film that dares to blend genres in ways that would become commonplace decades later, this forgotten gem deserves another look. Number 12. Play Dirty, 1969. This is what happens when a war movie strips away every last shred of heroism. Michael Caine leads a squad of criminals on what's basically a suicide mission across the North African desert. The production was cursed from the beginning. The original director either quit or was fired before filming even started. André de Toth stepped in with a completely different vision, caring more about explosions than character development. Caine later admitted it was one of the worst film experiences of his career, calling the director a one-eyed madman. United Artists hoped for another Guns of Navarone, a traditional war epic with heart. What they got was a nihilistic slog that audiences in 1969 rejected completely. The film barely made a third of its budget back and was branded morally reprehensible by several critics. The irony? Martin Scorsese later praised Play Dirty as one of the great anti-war films precisely because it's so uncompromisingly bleak. Its unflinching portrayal of war as meaningless bloodshed has earned it a cult following among filmmakers who appreciate its refusal to glorify combat. If you want a war movie that feels like a punch to the gut, Play Dirty delivers. Number 11. The Secret War of Harry Frig, 1968. This might be the strangest entry in Paul Newman's stellar career. He plays a U.S. Army private with a talent for escaping military prisons who gets parachuted behind enemy lines to rescue 5 Allied generals being held captive in an Italian villa. Sounds like a tense war drama, right? Except it's trying to be a comedy, and the generals are living in luxury playing golf on the villa grounds. Universal Studios thought Newman's star power alone would make this awkward mix of slapstick and war drama work. They paid him over $1 million, huge money in 1968, but even his considerable charm couldn't save a script that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Director Jack Smite had just finished working with Newman on Harper and pushed hard to re-team with him. The budget ballooned past $6 million, and critics absolutely savaged it. Roger Ebert famously wrote, "I've seen lousy movies before, but never one that seemed ashamed of itself." Newman seemed to agree, distancing himself completely and never mentioning the film again in interviews. The movie flopped spectacularly, making back barely half its budget. What makes it worth revisiting now is seeing how even a megastar like Newman could occasionally misfire, and how his natural charisma almost makes this tonal mess work anyway. It's a fascinating oddity in an otherwise brilliant career, showing that sometimes the strangest failures are more interesting than safe successes. Number 10. Patulia, 1968. Richard Lester's dazzling but downbeat look at love and disillusionment in 1960's San Francisco throws you off from the start. Julie Christie plays a restless socialite who begins an affair with a recently divorced doctor, played by George C. Scott. But this isn't your standard romance. The editing jumps between timelines, flashes forward and backward, and cuts so quickly that you're constantly disoriented, much like the characters themselves. The film was shot right before San Francisco's Summer of Love in 1967, capturing that psychedelic chaos perfectly while simultaneously critiquing it. Warner Brothers executives saw the final cut, panicked, and had absolutely no idea how to market it. Test audiences hated the fragmented storytelling and emotional coldness, so the studio shelved it for a full year while they tried to figure out what to do. When they finally released it in 1968, critics actually loved it. Pauline Kael called it one of the few truly complex, fully realized American films of the decade. But general audiences weren't ready for a movie this jagged and emotionally raw. It flopped hard at the box office, making back barely half its $2.5 million budget. Today, filmmakers like Steven Soderbergh and Paul Thomas Anderson cite Patulia as a major influence. Its innovative editing techniques, unflinching look at failed relationships, and refusal to provide easy answers make it feel more like a 1970s film than something from 1968. It's the movie that predicted where American cinema was headed years before anyone else caught on. Number 9. The Bridge at Remagen, 1969. You want a war film with real-life drama? The Bridge at Remigan has Soviet tanks literally rolling through its production. Based on the true story of American forces capturing one of the last standing bridges across the Rhine in the final days of World War II, The film stars George Segal and Robert Vaughn in a tense battle to either secure or destroy the crucial crossing. Here's where it gets wild. They filmed in Czechoslovakia in 1968, right when Soviet forces decided to invade the country. Suddenly, the film crew found themselves in the middle of actual tanks rolling through Prague. Cast and crew literally had to flee for their lives, leaving behind equipment and unfinished scenes. The Czechoslovak government even accused them of being American spies, using the movie as cover. Unsurprisingly, all this chaos ballooned costs way beyond the original budget. Insurance didn't cover Soviet invasion, so United Artists got stuck with the bill. When it finally limped into theaters, audiences barely noticed. The film didn't even crack $2 million at the box office and quickly vanished. What's remarkable is how good the movie still is despite its troubled production. The battle sequences are impressive, the moral complexity feels genuine, and the knowledge that real tanks were rolling just off-camera adds an eerie authenticity. As director John Gillerman later said, "We went to make a war movie and ended up in an actual war." For historical context alone, the bridge at Remigan deserves rediscovery. Number 8. The Fall of the Roman Empire, 1964. This is what happens when Hollywood bets everything on size. Producer Samuel Bronston built an entire Roman city in Spain, one that made actual Roman ruins look small by comparison. The cast included Sophia Loren, Alec Guinness, James Mason, and Christopher Plummer in a sprawling story about power, corruption, and imperial decline. The set was so massive it became a tourist attraction during filming. They recreated the Roman Forum at full scale, making it the largest outdoor set ever built at that time. Over 8,000 extras were employed, many of them from the Spanish army. The ambition was staggering. When it finally hit theaters, audiences had already seen enough sword and sandal epics. Ben-Hur, Spartacus, Cleopatra, they were tired of togas. At over 3 hours long and heavy on political speeches, The Fall of the Roman Empire couldn't find its audience. The box office was brutal, losing millions and effectively ending Bronston's production company. What's incredible is that the film itself is actually excellent. The chariot duel remains one of the most spectacular ever filmed, and its themes about how empires collapse from within feel startlingly relevant today. Martin Scorsese called it the last of the great epics, while Ridley Scott has acknowledged it as a major influence on Gladiator. For sheer ambition alone, this magnificent failure deserves another look. Number 7. The Loved One, 1965. MGM marketed this movie as the motion picture with something to offend everyone, and they weren't kidding. This pitch-black satire of America's funeral industry features embalming scenes, cremation cannons, rockets that shoot corpses into space, and a funeral director named Mr. Joyboy who still lives with his morbidly obese mother who's obsessed with pet food. Tony Richardson directed it fresh off his Oscar win for Tom Jones. MGM thought they had another prestige hit on their hands. After they saw his final cut, studio executives completely freaked out. They wanted something mainstream and easy to sell. What they got was something utterly bizarre and unclassifiable. Based on Evelyn Waugh's novel, the film takes aim at Hollywood, the funeral business, and American culture in general, with a savage glee that still feels shocking today. The cast included Jonathan Winters in dual roles, Rod Steiger, John Gielgud, Tab Hunter, and even Liberace in his only dramatic role. MGM ended up burying the movie, barely marketing it, and predictably it bombed hard, making less than a quarter of its $4 million budget. Critics were divided, with some calling it brilliant and others labeling it tasteless and mean-spirited. Today, filmmakers like John Waters and David Lynch cite The Loved One as a major influence. Waters called it beyond satire, beyond criticism, beyond comparison. For a film that dared to laugh at death itself with uncompromising weirdness, The Loved One remains shockingly original. Number 6. Major Dundee, 1965. This is what happens when a legendary director and a studio go to war. Sam Peckinpah wanted to make a sprawling Civil War Western epic with all the blood, sweat, and moral complexity you could handle. Columbia Pictures had other ideas. From the very start, Peckinpah clashed non-stop with producer Jerry Bressler and the studio. Right before shooting began, Columbia slashed his budget by $1.5 million. Then, Peckinpah did what Peckinpah does. He drank too much, argued with everyone, and nearly got himself fired during production. The only thing that saved him was star Charlton Heston, who gave up his salary to keep the film going. Heston even threatened Peckinpah with a sword, a real sword, when the director's behavior became too erratic. When Peckinpah finally delivered his cut, the studio chopped 40 minutes from it without his consent. The resulting version was a confusing mess that satisfied nobody. Critics called it bloated, overly ambitious, and unfocused. The film cost about $4.5 million and only made around $3 million back. Peckinpah himself called it the most painful experience of my career. For decades, only this butchered version existed until a restored cut with missing scenes was released in 2005. Even in its compromised form, Major Dundee shows flashes of the brilliance that would later define Peckinpah's masterpiece, The Wild Bunch. It's a fascinating glimpse of a great filmmaker struggling against studio interference, with sequences so powerful they shine through despite the chaos. Number 5. 55 Days at Peking, 1963. This one's about the Boxer Rebellion in China around 1900, with Charlton Heston as a tough-as-nails U.S. Marine leading an international force trying to hold off thousands of Chinese fighters. On paper, it sounds like a surefire hit, but behind the scenes, it was an absolute disaster. Producer Samuel Bronston built an entire replica of Peking in Spain at enormous cost. The set was so large it became a tourist attraction during filming. But the real drama was happening off camera. Stars Charlton Heston and Ava Gardner hated each other with a passion. He thought she was unprofessional and drinking too much. She thought he was stiff and boring. Their chemistry was non-existent. Even worse, director Nicholas Ray completely melted down during production. He fought constantly with Bronston, suffered a heart attack, and ultimately got fired before finishing the film. Gardner eventually had enough too. She walked off the set and never came back, forcing them to shoot her remaining scenes with a body double. China banned the film outright, calling it imperialist propaganda. Even with Heston's star power, the production chaos sank it at the box office. It lost millions and nearly bankrupted Bronston's production company. What's remarkable is that despite all this behind-the-scenes turmoil, the battle sequences are still impressive. And there's something fascinating about seeing soldiers from different countries forming an unlikely alliance. As Heston later wrote in his autobiography, sometimes the most interesting films come from the most troubled productions. For epic spectacle and historical curiosity, 55 Days at Peking remains worth rediscovering. Number 4. The Sand Pebbles, 1966. Before he was the king of cool in Bullet, Steve McQueen delivered his most nuanced performance in this epic about American gunboat diplomacy in 1920s China. He plays Jake Holman, a Navy engineer who just wants to run his engines but gets caught in the political chaos of a country on the brink of revolution. Director Robert Wise, fresh off The Sound of Music, went in the completely opposite direction with this complex, morally ambiguous war drama. Filming in Taiwan during monsoon season, the production was plagued by illness, typhoons, and McQueen's method-acting intensity. He insisted on doing his own stunts and demanded countless retakes, driving Wise to the brink of exhaustion. The film's refusal to take a simple stance confused audiences. Some saw it as pro-imperialism, others as a subtle anti-war statement. In 1966, with Vietnam escalating, this ambiguity didn't play well. Despite McQueen's first and only Oscar nomination, the film underperformed at the box office, barely recouping its massive budget. Today, The Sand Pebbles stands as a fascinating examination of American intervention overseas, with McQueen's performance showing depth beyond the action roles that made him famous. Quentin Tarantino has called it the most overlooked American epic of the 1960s, while critics now praise its nuanced handling of colonialism, racism, and misguided patriotism. At nearly 3 hours long, it's a slow burn, but one that rewards patience with a devastating final act. Number 3. Cleopatra, 1963. This is the movie that famously nearly destroyed its studio. 20th Century Fox initially budgeted it at around $2 million. It ended up costing over $40 million, which today would be about $430 million. Elizabeth Taylor alone got $1 million salary up front, plus a percentage of the profits, making her the first actor to earn that much for a single film. Things started going wrong immediately. The first director quit when Taylor kept getting sick, forcing production to shut down completely. Fox threw out everything they'd already shot in London and moved the entire production to Rome. That meant rebuilding enormous sets from scratch at enormous expense. Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who took over directing, shot so much footage that the studio considered releasing it as two separate movies. Instead, they went with one massive 4-hour film. And if that wasn't chaotic enough, Taylor and co-star Richard Burton began their famous affair right there on set, creating a scandal so huge the Vatican actually issued an official statement condemning them for erotic vagrancy. Despite all this drama, Cleopatra actually did make money. $57 million in the US, making it the highest-grossing film of 1963. But it still wasn't enough to cover its astronomical costs. Fox posted losses of $40 million, nearly collapsed, and had to sell off huge chunks of their studio land just to survive. The parcel they sold off is now Century City in Los Angeles. The irony is that beneath all the scandal and financial disaster, Cleopatra is genuinely impressive filmmaking, opulent, ambitious, and anchored by magnetic performances. As Martin Scorsese noted, sometimes the films that cause the most trouble end up being the ones we keep watching decades later. Number 2. Seconds, 1966. This might be the most disturbing film Rock Hudson ever made. He plays a banker who undergoes an experimental procedure to fake his death, get a new face and identity, and start life over as a successful painter. Sounds like a fantasy, right? Except his new life quickly becomes a nightmare, leading to one of the most shocking endings in 1960s cinema. Director John Frankenheimer shot the film in disorienting fisheye lenses and extreme angles, creating a visual paranoia that matched the story. Casting Hudson, known for romantic comedies, as the tormented protagonist was a brilliant move against type. Paramount had no idea how to market such a bleak psychological thriller. The posters made it look like a science fiction film, confusing audiences who were expecting something completely different. It premiered at Cannes to boos and walkouts. In the US, it bombed spectacularly, making less than a third of its budget. The failure hit Hudson hard. He'd taken the role hoping to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor, but audiences couldn't accept him in such a dark film. Frankenheimer later said, "Sometimes you make a film ahead of its time, and you pay the price for that." Today, Seconds is recognized as a masterpiece of paranoid cinema, influencing everything from The Game to Get Out. The Criterion Collection has preserved it, and directors like Christopher Nolan cite it as a major influence. For a film that dares to suggest the American dream might actually be a nightmare, Seconds remains shockingly relevant. Number 1. The Shooting, 1966. Before Easy Rider changed Hollywood forever, Jack Nicholson starred in this bizarre, existential western that subverts every genre convention. Two miners are hired by a mysterious woman to guide her through the desert, but her true motives remain hidden as the journey becomes increasingly surreal and threatening. Director Monte Hellman made this back-to-back with another experimental western called Ride in the Whirlwind, both on a combined budget of just $150,000. Shot in the Utah desert with a tiny crew, the production was as minimalist as the film itself. Most of the money went toward horses and keeping the cast alive in the brutal heat. When it was completed, no American distributor would touch it. It was too strange, too ambiguous, with an ending that still divides viewers today. The film barely got a release, playing a few art houses before disappearing entirely. Roger Corman, who produced it, later admitted he had no idea how to sell it to audiences. "It was too arty for the drive-ins and too violent for the art houses," he said. "It lost money and was forgotten for decades." The redemption story came much later. In the 1970s, European critics rediscovered it and proclaimed it a masterpiece of American minimalism. Quentin Tarantino has called it the best American Western of the 1960s, while the Coen brothers acknowledge its influence on their own work. For a film that dares to deconstruct an American genre from the inside out, The Shooting deserves its place as the most brilliantly underrated flop of the decade. So, which of these box office disasters deserves the biggest comeback? Was Cleopatra worth bankrupting a studio? Could The Shooting be the greatest Western you've never seen? Let us know in the comments which film you're tracking down first, and share any forgotten gems we missed. And ask yourself, in 50 years, Which of today's flops will film buffs be rediscovering as misunderstood masterpieces? Sometimes the movies that bomb the hardest end up having the most to say.